We live in a culture that is outraged. Everywhere we turn around, every corner, there's somebody else expressing a great deal of frustration, of anger, of indignation. And while there are some behaviors that we should be frustrated about, there are some beliefs that are clearly wrong. While we do have a right to express that the things that are happening at times in this world are not right, this culture brings with it a very special kind of concept. It's not just that a behavior is wrong. It's that anybody who chooses that behavior or that belief, that they in and of themselves have now stripped themselves of their own humanity. Our outrage is no longer an idea that an action is incorrect, but that an actual people are inhumane. And we strip them of their dignity as human beings. We see it on social media. We see it on the news. We see it in conversations. And it's not a concept of this is something that they're doing out there. This is something that resides within our own heart. We live in an outraged society. It empowers us and enables us to demean and dehumanize other people. And yet, if there was ever anybody that had the right to be outraged, it was Jesus. And while he looked at our sin as wrong and incompatible with who he was, as literally treasonous, he came down to this earth not to express an outrage toward us, but a love, a compassion, a grace. And so while the way of this world at this moment is the way of outrage, the way of Jesus has always been gentle, kind, receptive. While he very quickly names our sin wrong, he comes to us and says, you still have value and I want to redeem who you actually are. He responds to us not with an outrage, not stripping us of our dignity. Instead, he responds to us with the gentle love of a compassionate God. Over these next 4 weeks, we want to look at this concept of outrageous, a reflection on the gentle goodness of who God is. And as we understand the character and the nature of God, we will begin to comprehend that the way he desires for us to respond to the brokenness and the fallenness of this world is not an outrage, but with a gentle compassion as we share the love of Jesus with others. We're going to see that in Matthew chapter 11, where in the midst of his teaching, Jesus gives an amazing invitation. Listen to these words. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. My kids are of an age in which they're beginning to look at what the future might hold. We're beginning to have the just initial conversations of what college might be, of what career path they might want to choose. And what I so often tell my kids is what you need to do is you need to find a problem in the world that you're passionate about and go about either solving it or relieving the pressure from that problem. If you can do that, you may not make a ton of money, but you will always live a life of meaning and satisfaction. There's so many careers that do exactly that. It's one of the reasons I'm in the pastorate. It's one of the great privileges of being a teacher, of being in the medical profession, of being a law enforcement officer, of being a soldier, of finding a problem in the world and then doing something about it. Imagine if from the earliest of ages, you wanted to be a doctor. And so all throughout school, you were studying and you were learning and you took your studies very seriously. In high school, you graduated maybe near the top of your class. You got into a good undergrad program, did all the studies that you needed to do, did the extra work to then take the medical exam, to get into medical school so that hopefully you could pass the boards. And while your friends were out partying and playing around, you were back in your dorm studying, doing everything that you needed to do. And you went through residency and you finally got out on your own. When your friends had been been in their career for 15 years. You finally got out on your own, and now you're doing the job that you were called to do, to assist people, to alleviate the pain and suffering of others. And imagine after a long week of work that weekend you have call. It's not drudgery to you. It's just part of the job. It's part of what it is that you do. And so you go on call and you do everything that you're called to do. And many things are coming in. It's a busy day in many ways, and yet it's a productive day. And you know that you have helped people and assist people. And that night you go home and you have dinner with your family. And you have to go back up to the hospital after you put the kids to bed, but it's not that big of a deal. And you go back up and check on a few more things, do a few procedures maybe. You finally come home and you are exhausted, wiped out, exactly as humanity is supposed to be. You have given your absolute all to help and to assist others, to make the world a better place. You don't begrudge it one bit, but you can't go to sleep. And so you pull out your phone and you pull up Apple TV and you start watching the show, and you just want to drift off. You know tomorrow's a long day. You're on call again tomorrow. And right at the very moment that you begin to drift off to sleep, you set your phone on the nightstand and it rings. And in that moment, you're being called back to the hospital. At that exact second, do you love your job? Well, yes. In the overarching picture of things, yes. But do you want to go do it right then? No. You're tired. You wish it could wait till morning. You're kind of frustrated that maybe they didn't wait until the next day to call. Maybe it's not as important as they think in your mind. And you wish in that moment you didn't have to go. And you don't hate your job by any means. You want to help people. You want to assist people, especially the patient that is there. And yet in that moment, you're so weary, you just want to stay in bed and get some sleep and be fresh tomorrow. When I think about my sin, and I think about bringing it to Jesus, the picture that I so often get of Jesus is of a weary, tired doctor who I know is going to forgive me, who I know is going to love me, who I know that whenever I go and I call to him, he's going to rouse up and come to my aid. I know he's going to, but the assumption that I have in my heart is that in that moment, he's tired. He's tired of my sin. He's tired of the repeated behaviors. He's tired of having to forgive me one more time. And while he loves me and he enjoys who he is and what it is that he does, and he doesn't begrudge the idea of forgiveness or offering it to others, he just wishes that just on this one night, I would let him be at peace. You know what's interesting? That image that I have of Jesus is a very appropriate image of me. There are times in which I collapse into bed exhausted and the phone rings. There are other times in which I've been parenting all day, and at the very moment that I kind of want to be left alone, that's the very moment in which one of my children need me, and I love them. I have compassion upon them. Of course, I'm going to do the duties of a father, but in that moment, I'm just weary. It's a proper understanding of who I am. But in no way is it an understanding of God. At no point in all the Bible does God ever reveal himself. Does Jesus ever show himself as being somebody who is exhausted, who is tired of us, who doesn't want to deal with our sin one more time. Yes, whenever he was walking on this earth, he felt the normal exhaustion of humanity. There's no doubt about it. But at no point do we ever get the picture of Jesus almost begrudging a sinner for coming to him, of Jesus now feeling like he had to muster up just a little bit more forgiveness because he was weary and he was almost out of that kind of love. At no point does God reveal himself that way. As a matter of fact, it's the exact opposite viewpoint. At the end of Matthew chapter 11, Jesus has done some teaching. And at the end of Matthew chapter 11, he does something that he doesn't normally do. It's a pretty famous passage, and we hear it many times. He gives us this tremendous invitation to all people. He says, "Come to me now, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And he's speaking to a group of people now who are literally burdened down by their sin, burdened down by their lives. And what Jesus is saying in this moment is you can bring that to me. The people are almost stuck with almost two options. In that moment, because of their own sin, their own rebellion, the negative consequences of their own choices that they have made, they have two options in that moment. They can either try to deal with it on their own, try to bear it on their own, but that's exhausting, or they can turn to the Pharisees. And if they go to the Pharisees are going to belittle them and berate them and put all these expectations upon them and shame them for not being better, with the understanding that in the midst of all that shame, maybe, just maybe, you can earn some forgiveness. Those were the two options the people had in that moment. And Jesus now brings to the people a radically different option. You don't have to bear it on your own. You don't have to go to the Pharisees who are going to guilt you. Instead, come to me, all who are heavy laden and weary of all the chaos in your life, weary of your own inability to do things right, heavy laden now by the expectations that are upon you that you can't meet in any way. Jesus now says, come to me, and I'll give you rest. It's a rest that is the byproduct of forgiveness. It's the rest that now comes as we walk in obedience to Jesus, and some of the negative consequences of our own poor decisions begin to kind of drift away in some way. It's a rest that now comes with the understanding that we will spend eternity with God in heaven, that this world, while it may not make sense to us, there is a God who is at work in the midst of all of it. It's a rest where we don't any longer have to come up and provide our own sense of identity or value or worth. Instead, God himself gives that to us. It's a rest where we don't have to go down the religious path of trying to earn everything and prove ourselves righteous in any way. It's a rest that now comes in that we don't have to worry about what other people think about us or get our identity from them in any way, where we no longer have to strive at work to achieve something for ourselves. It's a rest now as we live the lives that God has called us to live, getting our value and identity and worth solely from him, expressing that love to other people. We've received it for ourselves. Jesus invites us into this radically different way. And whenever we look at this famous passage, so often that's where we stop. And yet we miss maybe the most surprising part of this. And that is Jesus actually reveals his heart. The great old preacher Charles Spurgeon said this is the only place in Scripture where Jesus actually talks about his heart. Many places in Jesus, he reveals who he is. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He says, I am the bread of life. He says, I am the resurrection. He reveals to us who he is. But here in this passage, he says, here's what my heart is like. And notice how he describes his heart. Verse 29. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. This is now the way of Jesus. This is the very heartbeat of Jesus. Gentle and lowly. That word lowly there, so often it's translated as the concept of humble. It shows now a position that's being held. This is who Jesus is, that he's lowly. Now, whenever we use this word humble or lowly, we can use it in a couple of different ways. And yet what Jesus is talking about now is a position kind of concept. If I say that he came from humble circumstances, there was a person that came from humble circumstances, we see that now as not living the high life, of now having a very kind of everyday, kind of common man background and experience. That's what Jesus is talking about here, that I am lowly in heart, which means the place that you can now find me is not in the upper echelon of society. It's not among the power trip and the influential people. Instead, there's a commonality about Jesus, that he makes himself common among the everyday men and women, that is the position and the place that he can be found. Imagine if you had a major problem. Imagine if you had a spouse that was desperately sick and you didn't have any insurance whatsoever. And you were trying to get the treatment that they needed, and yet you couldn't afford it, and you were being rejected by all these different places. And you had to find somebody to pay for this in order to save your spouse's life or your child's life. And so you went out on social media and you began to make great calls to different people, just trying to get the attention of somebody, just anybody. And imagine if a truly powerful person responded to your post. They heard your story, and they had compassion toward it. And now they have all the resources that are necessary to easily take care of your problem. They can write a check that will literally save your family member's life, whoever that person might be. Maybe in your mind, the most powerful person is a great athlete, a LeBron James, or a great actor of Tom Hanks. Maybe it's Jay-Z or Dr. Dre, whoever it might be. Imagine that person responding to you. And then them saying, hey, the next time you see me, come up and introduce yourself, and I'll give you the money. Well, what good would that do to you? Even if you had that powerful person that had the willingness to meet your need and had the ability to meet your need, you don't run in the same circles as Jay-Z. You're not going to run into LeBron James at the barbershop. You're not going to see the president out eating at your restaurant. And even if you did, there would be Secret Service agents all around him or her to where you wouldn't be able to come up to them. They would hold you back. They would keep you away. It would do you no good to have a powerful person that had a desire to assist you, that had the ability to assist you, if you couldn't actually interact with them. What Jesus is saying here is that he is lowly, that he doesn't run with the highbrow people, that he actually is in a location where you can find him. The old theologian said the great thing about the incarnation, the great thing about Jesus coming down in the form of a baby, is that God now had a zip code. It's where you can find him. You don't have to worry about Jesus being unfindable to you, no matter what your circumstances is, no matter what your situation, no matter where you are, where you've been, you can find Jesus. For he is lowly in heart. He is accessible, even to you. Where we live in a world where some are so powerful and influential and famous that we have no access to them, God has chosen to make himself accessible to all of us. And yet, just because he's accessible doesn't necessarily mean that we would want to come to him. And yet we have this other word that Jesus uses to describe himself. He says not just that he is lowly in heart. He also says that he is gentle. You see, if Jesus was harsh, if he was rough with our sin, even if he was accessible, even if he would be walking down our neighborhood, you and I would avoid him. We would try to deny our sin and get around him and not be around him because of the harshness with which he would come to us and interact with us. And yet Jesus instead says that he's gentle. In other places, this word that's translated here as gentle is translated in other places as meek. In the Beatitudes, Jesus talks about the power of meekness, the importance of meekness. The old illustration of what meekness is that it's power under control. Like a horse now under the control of a jockey. There's a great deal of strength that is there, and yet it chooses to be limited. And so oftentimes I think about power under control of my German Shepherd. That's the dog that's there. Such strength, such power, could literally take me in a moment if she wanted to, would defend my children and my wife at any second. There is a force that is there. And yet anytime my family is around, the ears go down. And there's just a longing in that moment to be loved. When Jesus here says that he is gentle, it doesn't mean that he's weak. It doesn't mean that he's wimpy in any way. So often we use the word gentleman in our society to connote a concept of wimpiness. That's not what gentleman really means. It is instead this power that's under control. When I wrote about marriage in a book using the Beatitudes, I talked about meekness as being this kind of middle part between apathy and aggression. Meekness now is not apathetic in any way. It is concerned about the issues that are at hand. The full energies and resources of the person is fully engaged. Jesus is not apathetic about our sin. He is not apathetic toward us. It's not that he has this great power and he chooses not to use it against us because he doesn't care in any way. We're like a gnat to him. It's not the case. Instead, he cares very much about who we are. He is not apathetic, but he's also not aggressive. He doesn't come at us. He doesn't lurch at us. He doesn't scare us or terrify us. He doesn't use his strength now to our own detriments. Instead, Jesus now is is meek. There's a power there, but a power that he has the ability to channel, to control. He has all the resources that we need now to take care of our sin, to change our hearts, to transform who we are, to create in our minds new ways of thinking, to create new habits, to redeem past mistakes and sins, and bring meaning to our past failures, and give us a purpose in the midst of this life, to radically transform who we are. He has all of that power. And yet that power never bleeds over to our own harm. Instead, he channels it for our own good. He is gentle. Chances are you and I aren't. Specifically when it comes to sin. When those around us make willful choices to rebel against God, or because of their own frail humanity, they make foolish choices that now create harm within their own lives and the lives of others, chances are you and I have one of two responses. If we love them or we don't care about them and they don't impact us in any way, we probably live in denial of their sins. We downplay their sins, almost in an apathetic kind of way. We pretend like what they've done really isn't that big of a deal. But if it creates great harm in our lives, or if we have no respect for the other person or no value for the other person, then we respond to their sin with outrage. It's not just that their behavior or belief is wrong. It's that they themselves carry no weight or value whatsoever. Their behavior or their belief is now evidence that they do not deserve the dignity of humanity. And we respond in an aggressive way, in an outrageous way, which then empowers and enables us to treat them however we want to treat them, to lie about them, to demean them, to belittle them, to prove and set ourselves up as better than who they actually are. And yet Jesus doesn't do that. If there was ever anybody who had any right to be outraged, it was Jesus. We had acted in a treasonous way against him. We had rebelled against him. We had said our way is better than your way. We had literally denied that he was even God himself. And yet Jesus didn't come to this earth outraged at us. He came to very clearly say that our sin was wrong. He came very clearly to show the difference between right and wrong. And yet he didn't strip us of our dignity. Instead, he gave us dignity. And the cross is this beautiful picture now of a proper response to sin, of where God's heart is. He is lowly, it says. There is nothing more low than the cross, the death in the form of a criminal, dying amongst criminals. Now, God himself, the Prince of Peace, now dying in the midst of criminals. God proved his lowly nature and coming in the form of a baby. He proved his lowly nature and even being befriending of us, of being friends of sinner. God has proven that he is lowly. And then on the cross, he proved that he is gentle. He had all the power available to him to call down angels from heaven, to take himself off the cross, to kill the very people killing him. And yet instead he began to pray, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He restrained that power and didn't use it for his own good, but instead submitted himself to a death for our own good. And he was gentle and lowly toward us. And now he invites us to be the same. That when our eyes are opened by God's grace, when we see the cross and we experience that life is found there, that we don't have to carry the weight of our sin around anymore, that we don't have to continue in the midst of these addictions, continue down this pattern of behavior that is destructive to ourselves and to others. Whenever we begin to understand what God's grace can do for us, and as we begin to obey him and find that there's life in the midst of that obedience, it causes us to have an energy and a passion and a gratitude toward God for the life that he has given us. And whenever we experience the gentleness of God come to us, we immediately begin to want to love our neighbors and to be gentle toward them. Not to deny their sin, not to downplay the wrongs, not to pretend like everything is okay or to give a further hurt to a victim, but instead to speak truth, to say what is right or wrong, but to speak it with compassion and a grace and a gentleness, with an intention of assisting others and helping them to experience the same life that we have found in Jesus, and the same meaning that comes as we begin to love other people. One of the great tests of whether or not we have truly experienced the forgiveness of Jesus is whether or not our outrage begins to be exchanged for a gentleness, a compassion, a love, even for those who are making choices that we would never make, even for those who believe things that we in no way believe. If you and I have received God's grace, we can't help but give it to others. Imagine being that doctor. That doctor who in the moment doesn't want to go to the hospital. But you know, she does. She gets up, grabs her a cup of coffee, gets back in the car that might be still warm from having just gotten home, and heads back to the hospital and walks into that room and with compassion and grace and skill figures out what the problem is and uses her ability then in that moment to meet the need. Imagine that doctor now being a believer in Jesus and having all these skills and abilities and understand the hurt and the pain that is present around the world. And imagine them talking at work one day and the doctor saying, hey, I think we need to go on a mission trip. I read about this country where they really don't believe in medical care. They don't have much access to medical care. And I know we can go do some very basic level things and really alleviate so much of the suffering that is there. And so that doctor rallies some people there at work around them, rallies some people at the church around them. And they do all the planning, and they get their shots and they get their passports and they sink all these resources into this trip. They buy their own tickets, they gather their own supplies, and they go off to this country. And they get there and they're all excited and they set up this medical tent. They get everything ready and they see people passing by every single minute. They see people passing by that they could help, that they know that just a simple procedure, just a simple action here or there could radically transform the lives of these people. And they begin to call out and to say, hey, come in here. I can help you. I can assist you. They get with locals trying to encourage other people to come in, but nobody will come in. There's a skepticism. And this is a country that is so uneasy and so uncertain about medical care that they refuse the help from the very person who loves them and is trying to help them. And imagine being that doctor standing outside that tent, so many resources behind you, so much ability in your own hands, so much education that you've been given. God has blessed you in so many ways, and now you just want to respond to that with just a small action, a small token of appreciation to help alleviate the suffering of other people. Imagine how you would be begging them to come in, hoping that it would come in. And finally, one person so fed up with their own life, so fed up with their own sickness and sorrow, feeling no hope whatsoever, thinks to themselves, well, what do I have to lose? And they enter into that doctor's tent. Imagine the excitement that doctor would have, how the whole staff would rally around, how that person would get exacting care, and how their lives could be radically transformed. And that person, whenever they got up, having experienced the change, would go out into the community and begin to tell everybody else about what that doctor had done to them. Imagine how the joy that doctor would feel as more people begin to trickle into that tent and literally would stay up, would work hour upon hour with an excitement and a joy because of everything that is taking place, because this is exactly what they desire to do. Jesus is that doctor. He's the one standing outside the tent begging people, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He is not the begrudging doctor in the bed who doesn't want to get up one more time to go to call. He is the passionate doctor outside the missionary tent saying, I can change your life. Come to me. I wonder today, will you have the courage to approach a gentle and lowly Jesus. For if you do, he will radically change your life. Let's pray. Most gracious Heavenly Father, give us that courage to come to you now. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.